This research project I'm engaged in is in collaboration with Dr. Lauren Marsh, who's the head of the Hugh Lawson Shearer Trade Union Institute at the University of the West Indies in Kingston, Jamaica, and with the participation of the Jamaica Household Workers Union, the JHWU, which is the largest domestic workers union in the Caribbean. When I submitted the abstract for consideration at this conference, it was really with the intent to present some data and analysis from the research, but this project, like so many others, has been interrupted and delayed with the COVID-19 pandemic. And while we're on the move now, we're not actually as far along as we'd like to be. But instead, I'll be presenting kind of an outline of the project, some context and questions we hope to answer. I couldn't pass up the opportunity to get feedback on this project from such an erudite audience such as yourself. The research sits at the intersection of two literatures. The first on labor standards enforcement, and in what Janice Fine has called the crisis of non-compliance in low-wage sectors, and the promise of participatory approaches to labor standards enforcement. And the second body of research is research on domestic work and domestic workers' rights in the context of the landmark ILO Convention C-189 on decent work for domestic workers, adopted in 2011. To date, 35 countries have ratified the convention. It pains me to tell you that Canada is not one of them. And with the adoption of C-189, I think we're seeing more research at both the regional and national scale on domestic workers' efforts to push their respective governments to ratify the convention. And for countries that have ratified on reforms to national labor law to bring countries into compliance with the convention. Now, Professor Blackett was the principal legal architect behind the convention and its accompanying recommendation. This convention is transformative in many ways, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't take this opportunity to thank Adele publicly for her work on the convention. So please join me in. So on to labor standards enforcement. This is an issue that's been discussed in one of the plenaries and in many different sessions. So I don't want to go into too much detail. There's great research being done by Janice Fine at Rutgers, Leah Vosco at York University, and the rest of the Closing the Research Gap Enforcement Group, among others. And the research points to a crisis, what Janice Fine calls a crisis of non-compliance in low-wage sectors, a crisis of employment standards enforcement. This crisis, of course, is rooted in the proliferation of precarious forms of employment, neoliberal labor market re-regulation, the inadequacies of dominant modes of enforcement, namely reactive enforcement of labor standards. And enforcement of labor standards is typically seen within the purview of government agencies, of the state. But in practice, both state and non-state actors can participate in ensuring compliance with employment standards. And research that the Leah Vosco and the Closing the Enforcement Gap research group have done look at organizations like worker centers, the Workers' Action Center, which you see, the symbol of which you see here, and which is based in Toronto, exploring the role of worker centers, of unions, of NGOs in labor standards enforcement. I think it's time we, as the Closing Enforcement Gap research group has written, and I quote, consider the capacity of worker organizations to create alternatives to individualized complaint-based mechanisms that fail to counter the inherently unequal power relations in workplaces and the top-down enforcement strategies of government agencies that accord workers a passive role in the enforcement process. For domestic workers in Jamaica, participatory enforcement is the key to, I think, moving from legal coverage to effective coverage, or from rights on paper to rights on practice and everyday conditions of dignity and respect. I think most of you will be familiar with some definitions around what a domestic worker is. In the convention, domestic work is work performed in or for a household or households. A domestic worker is any person engaged in domestic work with an employment relationship. 75 million workers, domestic workers, 1 in 25 working women in the world today is engaged in domestic work. Domestic work, of course, is highly feminized. 76% of domestic workers are women. The work is devalued, unrecognized, partly attributed to its association with women's unpaid work of social reproduction in the home. And it's traditionally been characterized by informality, poor working conditions, long hours, low wages, little or no social protection. Globally, according to the ILO, 8 out of every 10 domestic workers are informally employed and lack effective labor and social protections. So it's a particularly vulnerable group of workers and subject to low wages, poor working conditions, exploitation, sexual harassment, and other human rights abuses. Your ears must have been burning. I was just talking about your research on labor standards and enforcement. Yeah, I'll have to go back a couple of slides now. There are significant barriers to labor standards enforcement in domestic work. I'm going to speak of the CARICOM context, but I think this is applicable to other contexts, regional and country-specific contexts as well. The sheer number and dispersion of work sites. It's estimated in Jamaica that there's between 58,000 and 100,000 domestic workers. It's a big gap in terms of the estimate there. 86% of whom are women, and the majority of them are informal. Informality, of course, is a huge barrier to enforcement. There was a rise in terms of women's participation in the informal economy in Jamaica in the 1990s and 2000s. Domestic work, though, has always been the majority kind of informal in that context, in the historical context. In Jamaica, you see the problems when it came to COVID-19. The government's COVID-19 relief program, 45,000 domestic workers, it's estimated, were not eligible because of their informal status, were not eligible to claim those benefits, those relief benefits. As Adele and others have pointed out, the work, of course, is hidden, and I put this in quotations because, of course, feminist scholars have always problematized this definition and challenged the boundaries of the public and the private. The work is hidden in the private sphere of the household. In Jamaica, typically, or historically, there's been an exclusion of households from the legal definition of the workplace. Privacy laws prohibit the entrance of inspectors, labor inspectors, into private households. Workplace inspections are limited to the formal sector. And then there's also discrimination, who is deemed to be a priority for labor standards enforcement and inspection. Of course, in Jamaica, the majority of domestic workers are poor working class women of African descent, and complexion and class structure social inequality in Jamaica. And then there's a question of state capacities, whether a state which pays so much of its tax revenue over to the IMF in terms of debt servicing actually has the capacities to not only provide things like education and healthcare, but to actually have staff who are engaged in labor standards enforcement in the Ministry of Labor and Social Services. As a result of all these barriers, there's a significant enforcement gap. Studies have found that in the Caribbean, there are frequent violations of domestic workers' employment rights and a high incidence of employer non-compliance with existing laws. And that really labor departments across the Caribbean receive very few complaints from domestic workers, which signals not that there aren't violations, but it signals the ineffectiveness of reactive complaints-based enforcement of employment standards. Studies also find that domestic workers' knowledge of rights tend to be low, which further hampers their access to and realization of protections in law. So the dominant mode of labor standards, and I put this in quotation marks, of implementation is really voluntary compliance. The employers are just left to self-regulate, and it's assumed that workers have the power to advocate for themselves vis-a-vis their employers, which is absolutely ridiculous. So it's in this context, I think, the organization, empowerment, and mobilization of domestic workers themselves is key to fulfilling the promise of Convention 189, closing the enforcement gap and advancing decent work in the sector. The Jamaican Household Workers Union was established in 1991. They have 6,000 members, 6,000 domestic workers across 13 regional chapters. Their aims are to ensure fair and just working conditions, to protect the rights of domestic workers, to provide skills training, to empower domestic workers. While they do not engage in collective bargaining, they do use both political and symbolic power to advocate on behalf of domestic workers vis-a-vis governments and employers as well. Here we see on your left, the president, on the far left there, the president of the Jamaican Household Workers Union, the formidable and brilliant Shirley Price, who's been involved in the International Domestic Workers Federation as well, and members there celebrating after the ratification of C-189. The Jamaican Household Workers Union led civil society efforts with marches, letters to parliamentarians, protests, and workshops to ultimately push the government of Jamaica to ratify C-189 on the 11th of October, 2016. And the Jamaican Household Workers Union has been cultivating a relationship with the state. Following the ratification of C-189, the government began to review and amend existing legislation to assure alignment with C-189 provisions. Domestic workers, for instance, can now claim a maternity leave allowance for a period of 8 weeks. However, as Jamaica's first report to the ILO on C-189 suggests, there is still some ways to go to bring national law into compliance with C-189. So our hypothesis is really that I think we're going to argue, and I think that we hope the evidence kind of bears this out, at least what we've seen in terms of the research so far, is that Jamaican Household Workers Union is really engaging in participatory enforcement. And they're doing this through advocacy around the ratification and implementation and compliance with C-189. They did this around advocacy in terms of advocating for an increase in the minimum wage, advocacy to bring in, to encourage the government to ratify ILO C-190 on sexual harassment, and on pushing the government to pass a new Health and Safety Act, which would allow labor inspectors entrance into private residences, which is going to be very important in terms of enforcement. But they also engage, and this is a huge part of what they do in labor rights education. Pictured here is a manual they brought out last year for household workers and employers in Jamaica, a Know Your Rights and Obligations manual that they've distributed to all their members. And they do a tremendous amount of popular education around labor rights with their members, and also with employers and the government too. They provide assistance to domestic workers in navigating the complaints process, which, like most complaints processes, tends to be difficult to navigate, whether it be in Ontario or Quebec or Jamaica for that matter. They really promote written contracts. The vast majority of domestic workers in Jamaica have verbal contracts with their employers. They promote this they promote the standardization of written contracts with their members and with employers. Strengthening worker voice, really pushing for the registration of domestic workers to formalize their work, to move them from the informal to the formal through registration for things like Social Security. They've been engaged in a partnership with the ILO and the Jamaican Ministry of Labor around formalization, which really is a public awareness campaign to show domestic workers how to register for Social Security and economic relief schemes, and explain the importance of these protective programs. And they're engaged in a lot of knowledge sharing with the Ministry of Labor. Domestic workers know domestic work better than the Ministry of Labor does, better than the inspectors do, better than the minister does, better than high-ranking officials within the ministry as well. And I think, and I know that Janice distinguishes between participatory enforcement and co-enforcement in terms of more formalized relationship. But I think what we're seeing in Jamaica is a kind of emerging regime of co-enforcement in the sector. So the research that we're going to be doing in the next couple of months, and we have a survey that's already out in the field, in which we surveyed 200 domestic workers in the 2 parishes of Kingston and St. Andrew. 100 of our sample being 100 unionized domestic workers and 100 non-union domestic workers. And we want to find out, is it the case that members of the union are more likely to know their rights? Is there a knowledge gap between unionized and non-union domestic workers? Are union members more likely to bring a labor standards complaint to the ministry? Are they more likely to have a written contract as opposed to an oral contract, verbal contract? Do they have other indicators of formalization in terms of their contributions to Social Security, but also employer contributions to Social Security? We'll also be doing interviews with Ministry of Labor officials to try to understand how they treat complaints from domestic workers and where they fall in terms of the triad of complaints. Do they prioritize them? Or do they prioritize complaints that are coming from large work sites, factories, traditionally kind of male-dominated occupations and work sites? Is there a difference between how they treat the complaints of union versus non-union workers, domestic workers? Are they a little bit, I hope they are they a little bit scared of the union? So if there is a complaint coming from a member of the union, how do they treat that? Is there a difference in how they treat it with a non-union domestic worker? How do they deal with employers? How do they assess appropriate rewards and remedies? I think there's a lot of steps that really to bring the government into and domestic labor law and national law into compliance with C-189. And I think the union is thinking about whether they should urge the government to draft a comprehensive employment bill that covers domestic workers' rights rather than implementing kind of piecemeal amendments to existing legislation. Thank you. In order to ensure a better administration of labor laws. They're also pushing the government to ensure that it provides an adequate and appropriate system for labor inspections that extends to the informal sector to ensure that domestic workers in informal employment have those protections and that there's labor standards enforcement there as well. We'll be exploring whether the possibilities of moving towards a model of collective bargaining, the innovative models of collective bargaining that you see in some Latin American countries around domestic work, and whether it's applicable to the Jamaican context. And how can the union continue to kind of foster participatory or engage in participatory enforcement of labor standards and foster a co-enforcement regime? Well, and this is an awkward question, while maintaining a critical distance from the state. Is there a potential risk of co-optation, getting too close to the state when it comes to building a co-enforcement regime, engaging in participatory enforcement? And what are those perils? And how would the union kind of navigate its relationship to maintain both a relationship, but a critical distance from the state as far as building that relationship? Thank you very much.